Welcome to our presentation, Doing Violence, Suffering Bodies in a Refugee Arrival Center in Germany. My name is Jana Costas.
And I'm Philipp Arnold.
Violence remains a marginalized topic in management and organization research. Especially physical violence has received scant attention so far. So what is physical violence? Following Heinrich Popitz, the sociologist, physical violence is about the bodily capacity to harm others, as well as the vulnerability to be harmed. In some ways, it's not surprising that our field has largely neglected the topic of violence. Our modern societies, so the common narrative, have overcome violence due to the civilizing process, as Norbert Elias put it. So the idea is that violence is something of the past, something archaic, something that we no longer need because we have more subtle forms of social control in place. Following Max Weber, moreover, it is only in the context of state institutions, the military or the police, that violence is legitimate. In fact, it's the role of the state to contain violence. Now, these assumptions about modernity, violence and control are reflected in our field to the extent that if we look at violence, usually it is symbolic violence, and the few studies that have looked at physical violence regard it as pathological or as illegitimate as it is carried out by non-state actors. Our paper seeks to problematize extant assumptions by showing how violence still matters today. In particular, we draw attention to an organization that contracts private security guards in order to mobilize violence. Now, private security guards are a very interesting phenomenon. First of all, at least in Germany, there are by now as many private security guards as there are police officers. Second of all, in contrast to the police, private security guards as non-state actors lack a legal mandate to actually engage in violence. Nevertheless, they do so, as we will show, without necessarily disobeying the law. So here's our research question, or research questions. How do private security guards practice violence at the boundary of legality? How does the law shape the ways in which they practice violence, and how do they construct these practices as legitimate? In order to address these questions, we draw up an ethnography that Philipp conducted at an arrival center for refugees and asylum seekers in Germany. Such arrival centers assume particular importance in the course of the so-called refugee crisis. Arrival centers also typically contract private security guards in order to engage in various duties, such as patrol duties, access control, enforcing housing rules, as well as handling surveillance technologies. So the question is, how does violence feature in their everyday work?
For the security guards in the arrival center, violence is perceived as a normal aspect of their work. They take on the role of rule enforcers for the center's management. And violence will often play a role when they break up conflicts or when they are tasked with evicting inhabitants from a certain area or room. In our analysis, we identified two overarching ways in which violence is practiced: signaling violence and engaging in violence. When signaling violence, security forces use what we term ceremonial bodies, which is a ritualized form of authority that is built on and maintained by the interplay of respectable bodily distance and threatening bodily proximity. Furthermore, security guards strategically use the items and equipment that they have available, such as cut-resistant gloves, handcuffs, and radios. Security guards also attempt to sensually dominate the arrangements that they police, such as through talking loudly, silencing others, or policing the range of behavior that is acceptable in a certain situation, such as forbidding humor, for example. When engaging in violence, our second overarching way of practicing violence, we differentiate between pushing and colliding. When pushing, guards use violence but attempt to mask it as non-violent. For example, they will put their arm around somebody and basically shove them out of a room. They will combine these techniques with intense forms of talk that they perceive as de-escalating and distracting in an attempt to reach their goal before the person really knows what's going on. When colliding with resistant inhabitants, security guards prefer techniques such as wrestling or tackling, and oftentimes handcuffing. They prefer those techniques because they can be rationalized as defensive techniques, in contrast to kicks or punches, which might easily seem aggressive to outward observers. Importantly, security guards are also aware of their own bodily vulnerability and concerned about their ability to legitimize their use of violence, which is why they prefer non-colliding forms of conflict resolution. Our research makes three overarching contributions to the extant literature. First, we advance violence as an insightful concept in management and organization studies. We argue that violence, especially physical violence, is not absent from contemporary organization and society and not necessarily contained in state institutions. By analyzing doing violence, we focus on the importance of the potentiality and the engagement of violence. Our second contribution addresses the notion of power in our field. We argue that power is not always subtle, as inspired by the Foucauldian notion of discipline. We argue that power is, in fact, oftentimes not subtle at all and can be direct and coercive. And this sovereign form of power relies on negative complicity in contrast to positive complicity, for example, through rule enforcement. Our third contribution links the notion of violence and power to the concept of the body. We argue that the body is not always docile and malleable, once again, as implied by the Foucauldian notion of discipline. But we argue that the body is vitally affected by violence and that this is inescapable. And for this, we coin the metaphor of the suffering body. We would like to thank you for your interest in our research. And furthermore, we would like to thank AOM's CMS division for the opportunity to present our work in this way. We feel honored to be awarded the Best Critical Paper Award 2020, sponsored by the journal Organization.
Thank you.